What if contact didn't come with lights in the sky? What if it came through your phone showing the wrong time? What if the first sign of alien presence wasn't a craft descending from the clouds, but a notification arriving 3 minutes late? Tonight's story explores the most terrifying possibility of all, that we've already been found, measured, and catalogued without ever seeing what found us. The day the signals arrived late. It started on a Wednesday, not with fanfare, not with warnings. Just a Wednesday in late October when Rebecca Torres noticed her phone felt slow. She was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Portland, waiting for a client meeting that would never feel quite real. The autumn light came through the window at that particular angle that makes everything look like a photograph from someone else's life. She'd ordered her usual Americano. She'd opened her laptop. She'd glanced at her phone to check the time. 11:23. She looked at her laptop. 11:19. Rebecca frowned, checked her watch. 11:20. She picked up her phone again. Now it said 11:24. The devices disagreed with each other in small ways, not dramatically. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Just enough to feel wrong. She refreshed her email. Nothing. She knew she should have received confirmation from her client by now. The meeting was supposed to start in 7 minutes, according to her laptop. 11 minutes, according to her phone. 10 minutes, according to her watch. Rebecca looked around the coffee shop. Other people were staring at their phones with expressions she recognized. Confusion. That slight tilt of the head that means something doesn't match expectations. A man near the window tapped his phone screen repeatedly, muttering to himself. A woman at the counter asked the barista what time it was, then looked at her own phone and frowned. The barista checked the register, checked his watch, then shrugged. This was how it began for Rebecca Torres. This was how it began for millions of people across the Northern Hemisphere that Wednesday morning. With small discrepancies, with delays that felt technical, with the creeping sensation that the infrastructure everyone relied on had developed a barely perceptible stutter. By noon, the feeling had spread from individual confusion to collective unease. By evening, it had become something else entirely. Chapter 1. The infrastructure problem. The first official reports came from the East Coast. Emergency dispatch centers in Boston reported timestamp mismatches on incoming calls. Nothing critical. Just enough to cause confusion when calls were logged. A call received at 10:15 would be stamped 10:19, then 10:22. The delays weren't consistent. A dispatcher named Marcus Chen had been the first to notice the pattern. He'd been working the morning shift when a woman called about a medical emergency. The call came in, he logged it, sent paramedics to the address, standard procedure. But when he checked the system log afterward, the timestamp showed the call had come in 4 minutes after he'd already dispatched the ambulance. He'd thought it was a computer error, reset the system, checked again. The timestamp remained impossible. Then another call came in, another timestamp mismatch, and another. By mid-morning, every dispatcher in the Boston Center was experiencing the same thing. Calls arriving with timestamps that didn't match reality. Sometimes the timestamps were ahead, sometimes behind, never by the same amount. Traffic management systems in Philadelphia began registering vehicles at intersections several seconds before they actually arrived. Traffic cameras showed cars approaching lights, but the system registered their presence before they entered the frame. The city's traffic engineer, Patricia Okonkwo, had spent 3 hours on Wednesday morning trying to diagnose what she assumed was a sensor malfunction. She'd reviewed footage from dozens of intersections. Every single one showed the same impossible pattern. vehicles being detected before they arrived. At first she thought the cameras were out of sync with the sensors, but the cameras themselves showed normal footage. Cars approached, cars stopped, cars proceeded, nothing unusual. It was the system's interpretation that was wrong. The metadata, the timestamps embedded in the video streams, contradicted what the video actually showed. Patricia had documented 17 cases of this temporal impossibility before noon, each one identical. Detection preceding visual confirmation by anywhere from 3 to 11 seconds. GPS navigation in New York City started providing directions that felt perpetually behind. Turn left here, but here had been 3 blocks ago. Recalculating, recalculating, recalculating. Taxi drivers noticed it first, their navigation apps lagging behind reality. Instructions arriving late, as if the satellites overhead were receiving position data from the past rather than the present. A driver named James Wilson had pulled over on Amsterdam Avenue, frustrated and confused. His GPS showed him 3 blocks south of where he actually was. He'd refreshed the app, restarted his phone. The position updated eventually, but slowly, as if the system was struggling to catch up with where he actually existed in space. Other drivers reported the same issue. Delivery trucks missing turns because directions arrived too late. Ride-share vehicles confusing passengers by appearing to be miles away when they were actually approaching. The Federal Communications Commission received over 8,000 reports in the first 6 hours. The complaints were maddeningly vague. Phones felt slow. Messages arrived late. Time seemed off. Technical support centres were overwhelmed. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, all reporting surges in customer complaints about delayed notifications, slow data speeds, messaging apps that seemed to stutter and lag. But the infrastructure itself tested normally. Cell towers operated within specifications. Data throughput was normal. Signal strength was fine. The delays weren't in the network. They were in time itself. By Wednesday evening, the phenomenon had spread across the entire eastern seaboard and was moving west at roughly 30 miles per hour. Slow enough to track, fast enough to feel inevitable. Rebecca watched the news that night in her apartment, her phone beside her on the couch, her laptop open, her kitchen clock visible across the room. All showed different times. The variance had grown. Now it was minutes instead of seconds. Her phone, 7:49. Her laptop, 7:38. Kitchen clock, 7:42. The news anchor looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing off camera, presumably at a producer or a clock. His cadence was off, like he was trying to match his speech to a rhythm that kept changing. Authorities are investigating widespread reports of timing irregularities affecting cellular networks, internet services, and GPS systems across the continental United States, he said. The Department of Homeland Security has issued a statement indicating that there is no evidence of a cyber attack or foreign interference. Engineers at major telecommunications companies report that their systems are functioning within normal parameters. Functioning within normal parameters. Rebecca looked at her phone. 7:53 now. Her laptop, 7:38. Still, the laptop's clock had stopped advancing entirely. She refreshed the page. The browser hung for what felt like 30 seconds, but might have been less or more. Time had become subjective in a way that made her head hurt. When the page loaded, the laptop clock jumped forward. 7:56. Her phone now read 8:04. She stood up and walked to the kitchen. The clock on the microwave said 7:31. The clock on the stove said 8:09. Rebecca opened her kitchen drawer and pulled out an old battery-powered clock she kept for power outages. It read 7:47 and was ticking normally, each second distinct and regular. She set it on the counter and watched it for a full minute by her count. It advanced exactly 1 minute, but in that same span, her phone jumped from 8:04 to 8:11. Her laptop went from 7:56 to 8:01. The microwave clock didn't change at all. This wasn't a technical problem. This was something else. Chapter 2. The first impossible event. The voicemail arrived Thursday morning. Rebecca woke up to 17 notifications on her phone. Most were news alerts about the timing irregularities that were now affecting the entire country. 2 were messages from friends asking if her clocks were acting weird. 1 was from her mother in Sacramento, saying the whole thing was probably Russian hackers. And 1 was a voicemail from her own number. She stared at it for a long moment, sitting up in bed, the morning light making patterns on her wall that looked the same as always, even though nothing felt the same anymore. The notification said the voicemail had been received yesterday at 4:37 in the afternoon, but Rebecca had been in meetings all afternoon yesterday. She'd had her phone with her. It hadn't rung. She tapped the message. Her own voice came through the speaker, quiet, strained. "Rebecca, this is you. I know how this sounds. I need you to listen carefully. At approximately 2:15 this afternoon, you're going to receive a call from a number you don't recognize. Answer it. The person calling will ask if you've experienced any unusual temporal phenomena. Say yes. They'll ask you to come to an address in Beaverton. Go. I can't explain this yet, but you need to trust yourself. This is real. Time is not what we thought it was. The delays are not random. There's a pattern. Someone is..." The message cut off. Rebecca played it again and again. It was definitely her voice. Not a recording she'd made before. Not something synthesized. Her voice with the exact inflections she used when she was scared and trying to sound calm. She checked the timestamp again. Sent yesterday at 4:37 p.m. She looked at her call logs. No outgoing call at 4:37 yesterday. No call to her own voicemail. Nothing. Her hands were shaking. She took a screenshot of the voicemail notification, then opened her laptop to see if it had synchronized. It hadn't. Her laptop showed no record of the voicemail at all. Rebecca looked at the time on her phone. 8:33 a.m. On her laptop. 8:19 a.m. On her bedside alarm clock. 8:41 a.m. She got dressed in a daze, moving through her morning routine on autopilot, while her mind spun in circles. The voicemail had referenced 2:15 this afternoon. Something about a call. Someone asking about temporal phenomena. Temporal phenomena. That's what the news was calling it now. Not glitches, not errors, phenomena. Chapter 3. Collective Desynchronization. By Thursday afternoon, the internet had become a catalogue of impossible events. Reddit threads with thousands of comments, people sharing experiences that sounded like science fiction, but were documented with screenshots, videos, confused testimonials. A woman in Chicago received an email from her boss about a project deadline. The email was dated 3 days in the future. When she called her boss to ask about it, he had no memory of sending it and couldn't find it in his sent folder. But she could read it. It referenced meetings that hadn't happened yet and decisions that hadn't been made. The email was specific. It mentioned a client named Meridian Technologies choosing the blue proposal over the red one. It referenced a conversation between the boss and a vendor that would take place on Friday afternoon. It included details about an office coffee machine breaking down and being replaced. The woman, whose name was Jennifer Alvarez, had taken screenshots, posted them online. The email header showed all the correct metadata for her company's mail server. Everything authenticated properly. The email was real, but it was dated Saturday, and today was Thursday. A security guard in Atlanta reviewed surveillance footage from his building's lobby. The timestamp on the footage showed yesterday morning, but the footage showed people he'd seen this morning. Same clothes, same conversations he'd overheard. The footage was from the future, but labelled as the past. The guard, Robert Hall, had been doing his job for 19 years. He knew the regular tenants, knew their routines. When he reviewed the footage timestamped for Tuesday at 8:45 a.m, he saw Michael from accounting wearing his blue striped shirt and carrying his distinctive orange thermos. Robert specifically remembered seeing Michael wearing that exact outfit this morning. Wednesday, not yesterday. He'd scrubbed through more footage, found other discrepancies. A FedEx delivery that the footage showed happening Tuesday afternoon had actually occurred Wednesday morning. Robert had signed for the package himself, he remembered, but the security system insisted these events had happened yesterday. Robert had exported the footage files, checked the metadata. The timestamps were embedded at the hardware level. They couldn't be easily faked or manipulated. The system was showing the future, labelled as the past. A teacher in Minneapolis received 17 missed calls from her daughter's phone. All time-stamped between 3 and 4 a.m. last night, but her daughter had been asleep in the next room. Her phone had been on the nightstand, powered off. The teacher, Amanda Reeves, had checked her daughter's phone in the morning. No outgoing calls in the log, no evidence that the phone had even been turned on during the night. But Amanda's phone showed 17 missed calls, each one less than a minute apart. 3:04 a.m, 3:08 a.m, 3:11 a.m, all the way through to 3:57 a.m. She'd tried calling the number back. It had rung through to her daughter's voicemail. Amanda had asked her daughter about it. The girl, only 14, had looked frightened. She said she dreamed about trying to call her mother over and over, unable to get through, feeling desperate and afraid. But it had been a dream. She hadn't actually made the calls, except Amanda's phone said she had. A programmer in Seattle wrote a script to log the timestamps from different sources: his computer's internal clock, time servers on the internet, his phone, his smartwatch. The logs showed them diverging and reconverging in waves. Sometimes his phone was ahead by 12 minutes, then behind by 6, then ahead by 23. The pattern wasn't random. It followed a curve, a sine wave with increasing amplitude. The programmer Kevin Tran had plotted the data on a graph. The pattern was unmistakable, a smooth oscillation with a period of approximately 6 hours, the amplitude growing over time, reaching a maximum divergence of nearly 40 minutes between different time sources, then decreasing again. He'd posted his findings on GitHub. Within hours, other programmers had replicated his methodology. They all found the same pattern, the same 6-hour periodicity, the same sine wave curve. Someone created a website to crowdsource the data. Thousands of people submitted their own time measurements. The aggregate data painted a clear picture. A wave of temporal distortion moving across North America from east to west, affecting every timekeeping device differently, but following a predictable mathematical pattern. A college student in Austin experienced something even stranger. She'd set her phone alarm for 7 a.m. When it went off, she woke up, checked the time. 7:03. She'd hit snooze. 9 minutes later, the alarm went off again. She checked the time, 6:58 a.m. She'd gone backward, lost 11 minutes, or gained them. The directionality of time had briefly reversed. The student, Maria Santos, had been terrified. She'd gotten out of bed, checked every clock in her apartment, They all showed different times. Her microwave, 7:09, her laptop, 6:51, her wall clock, 7:14, her phone, 6:58. She'd sat on her bed and watched them. Over the course of 30 minutes, they'd slowly converged, all approaching 7:26 from different directions, like separate runners reaching a finish line from different starting points. No two people experienced exactly the same delays. Everyone's devices disagreed with each other and with themselves in slightly different ways. But everyone agreed that something was fundamentally wrong with time itself. Online communities began mapping the phenomenon. Someone created an interactive map showing reported temporal anomalies across the country. The pattern was clear: a wavefront moving westward, leaving behind a wake of confused people and desynchronized devices. The wave had started on the East Coast Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, it had crossed the Appalachians. By Thursday afternoon, it was approaching the Rockies, and everywhere it passed, time became negotiable. Rebecca sat in her living room at 1:45 in the afternoon, watching her phone and waiting. The voicemail had said 2:15, a call from an unknown number. She'd already decided she would answer. What else could she do? Pretend she hadn't heard her own voice telling her to trust herself? At 2:11 according to her phone, 2:03 according to her laptop, and 1:58 according to the battery clock she'd placed on the coffee table, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. "Hello? Is this Rebecca Torres?" A woman's voice. Professional, calm. "Yes. Have you experienced any unusual temporal phenomena in the last 48 hours? Rebecca's throat went dry. "Yes. I'm going to give you an address in Beaverton. Can you come today?" "Who is this?" "My name is Lee Morrison. I'm a physicist with a naval research laboratory. We're coordinating with civilian volunteers who've experienced specific types of temporal anomalies. You received a message from yourself, correct?" Rebecca's heart hammered. "How do you know that?" "Because you're not the only one. Can you come to the address?" "What's happening?" "We don't know yet, but we need people who've experienced causality inversions to help us understand the pattern. Will you come?" Rebecca looked at the battery clock. 2:04. Her phone said 2:18. Her laptop said 2:11. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." Chapter 4. The pattern emerges. The address in Beaverton turned out to be a nondescript office building near the Max light rail station. Lee Morrison met Rebecca in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a lanyard identifying her as government personnel. They went up to the 3rd floor, into a conference room that had been converted into something between a command centre and a college study session. Whiteboards covered with equations, laptops everywhere. A dozen people, mix of ages and apparent backgrounds, some in suits, some in jeans and hoodies. "Thank you for coming," Lee said, gesturing to a chair. "I know this is disorienting." "That's one word for it," Rebecca said. Lee pulled up a presentation on a large monitor, a map of the United States with a colour gradient overlay that looked like a weather system. "This is the temporal deviation map," Lee said, updated in real time based on timestamp discrepancies reported from millions of devices: phones, computers, traffic systems, satellites, everything that keeps time. The map showed a wave of distortion moving across the country from east to west. Not uniformly, but in a clear progression. "It started Tuesday night on the East Coast," Lee continued. "By Wednesday morning, it had reached the Mississippi. By this morning, it had crossed the Rockies. Current velocity is approximately 28 miles per hour. Consistent, predictable." "What's causing it?" Rebecca asked. That's what we're trying to understand. At first we thought it was a software issue, a cascading failure in time synchronization protocols. But the systems are working correctly. The atomic clocks are functioning. The GPS satellites are fine. The discrepancies are appearing despite everything working as designed. A man across the table, younger, probably early 30s, spoke up. It's not our infrastructure. Something external is interfering with how time propagates. This is James Park, Lee said. Astrophysicist. He's been analysing the wave pattern. James pulled up another slide. A graph showing oscillating lines that looked like audio waveforms. This is the temporal displacement over time at a fixed location, he said. Notice the pattern. It's not random noise. It's a sweep, like something is scanning. Rebecca stared at the graph. Scanning for what? We don't know, but look at the frequency. He zoomed in. The wave passes through a region in approximately 6 hours. During that time, the temporal deviation increases to a maximum displacement of about 43 minutes, then decreases back to normal. The pattern is identical in every location. Perfect replication. Something is measuring us, Lee said quietly. The room went silent. Rebecca thought about her voicemail, her own voice from a message she hadn't sent, referencing a future she hadn't lived yet. The causality inversions, she said, the messages from the future, their side effects? We think so, Lee said. When the temporal field reaches maximum deviation, some signals can propagate backward along the gradient. Information leaks across the boundary. Not much, not far, but enough to create paradoxes. How many people have experienced this? We've documented over 300 cases of verified causality inversion. Messages from the future, events perceived before they occur, memory of things that haven't happened yet, all concentrated in the peak deviation zones. Rebecca pulled out her phone. The screen showed 2:51. She looked at the clock on the wall. 3:07. When does the wave reach the west coast? She asked. Lee checked her laptop. Full passage over Portland should be complete by midnight tonight. After that, the deviation returns to baseline. And then what? Then we wait and see if it happens again, or if this was a one-time event. You don't think it's one time, Rebecca said. Lee met her eyes. No, I don't. Chapter 5. The sky is never mentioned. What was remarkable about the entire phenomenon was what didn't happen. No one reported seeing anything. No objects in the sky, no lights, no sounds, no physical manifestations of any kind. The only evidence that something extraordinary was occurring came from the infrastructure, from the clocks, from the timestamps, from the invisible architecture of timekeeping that modern civilization had built and now relied upon absolutely. In the history of UFO reports and alleged alien encounters, there had always been something to see. Lights in the sky, craft hovering over highways, structured objects photographed against clouds. Even the most skeptical analyses of these reports acknowledged that people claimed to witness physical phenomena. But this was different. This was invisible. If you looked at the sky on Wednesday or Thursday, while the temporal wave passed over your location, you saw exactly what you always saw. Blue during the day, stars at night, clouds, birds, airplanes following their usual routes. Nothing unusual, nothing to photograph, nothing to point at and say, there, that's what's causing this. The phenomenon existed entirely in the metadata of modern life, in the timestamps on emails, in the GPS coordinates that didn't match physical location, in the system logs that showed impossible sequences of events. Rebecca stayed at the Beaverton facility through the afternoon, listening to reports from other volunteers, from government scientists, from engineers at telecommunications companies who were trying to explain something that defied explanation. One engineer from Google, a man named Thomas Park who'd flown in from Mountain View that morning, described the phenomenon in terms that made Rebecca's head hurt. Our data centers sync time using atomic clocks and GPS signals, he explained to the group assembled in the conference room. We need microsecond precision for search queries, ad auctions, all our services. When the temporal wave passed over our California facilities, we saw something unprecedented. He pulled up a technical diagram on the monitor, graphs showing time synchronization between different servers. Normally, all our servers agree on time within microseconds, but during the wave passage, different servers were experiencing different rates of time flow. A server in Mountain View thought it was 3:04 p.m. A server 20 feet away thought it was 2:57 p.m. They were both right according to their local atomic clocks, but they couldn't both be right. How is that possible? Someone asked. It shouldn't be, Thomas said. Time is supposed to be consistent across a local reference frame. Two clocks in the same room should agree. That's fundamental physics. But these didn't. It's as if space-time itself was being warped differently in different locations, creating time dilation effects without any corresponding gravitational or velocity differences. Another scientist, a woman from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, shared similar findings from satellite systems. Our GPS satellites maintain incredibly precise time, she said. They have to, because GPS works by comparing timestamps from multiple satellites. Your phone receives signals from 4 or more satellites, compares their timestamps, and triangulates your position based on the tiny differences in signal arrival time. She paused, organizing her thoughts. During the temporal wave, our satellites were functioning perfectly. Atomic clocks on board were stable. Signal transmission was normal. But the timestamps received on the ground didn't match what the satellites were broadcasting. It's as if the signals were experiencing time dilation during their journey from orbit to Earth's surface. That's impossible without massive gravitational fields, someone said. Yes, it should be impossible, but we have the data. GPS signals were being temporally shifted during their propagation through what should be empty space. A woman from Denver described receiving a text message from her sister warning her about a car accident. The message had arrived 2 hours before the accident occurred. She changed her route based on the warning. The accident happened anyway. Different location, same time. Causality bent but didn't break. The woman's name was Christine Wu. She'd been driving to work Thursday morning when her phone buzzed. Text from her sister, Sarah. Don't take I-25 south. Bad accident at the Alameda exit. Take Broadway instead. Christine had been confused. She was already on Broadway, heading downtown. She hadn't been planning to take I-25, but the message bothered her. She called Sarah. No answer. She'd continued to work, parked, gone inside. 2 hours later, Sarah called her back. Did you get my text? Sarah asked. Yeah, this morning, but I wasn't taking I-25 anyway. What? I just sent it like 5 minutes ago. There's a huge accident on I-25 at Alameda. Traffic is completely stopped. Christine had checked her phone. The text showed a timestamp from 2 hours earlier. She'd showed it to Sarah later. Sarah's phone showed the text being sent 2 hours later than Christine received it. The message had travelled backward in time, but the accident had still happened, exactly as warned. Different cars, different people, but same location, same approximate time. Causality had bent. Information from the future had leaked into the past. But the future had still occurred as predicted. A man from Kansas City had seen security footage of himself entering his office building. The footage was time-stamped 8 hours in the future. He'd watched himself on the monitor, doing things he hadn't done yet. Then 8 hours later, he'd done them exactly as the footage showed. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd been reviewing security footage Thursday morning, looking for a package delivery that had gone missing. He'd scrubbed through the footage from the previous day, looking for the FedEx truck. But when he'd gotten to footage time-stamped for 4:30 p.m. today, he'd frozen. He saw himself on the monitor, walking into the building lobby, checking his phone, heading toward the elevators. But it was only 8:30 a.m. 4:30 hadn't happened yet. Marcus had stared at the footage, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He watched himself on the screen for nearly 2 minutes of footage, saw himself wait for the elevator, saw himself get in, saw the elevator doors close. He'd taken a screenshot of the footage, time-stamped for 4:32 p.m. today. Then he'd gone about his day, disturbed but not sure what else to do. At 4:30 p.m, he'd walked into his building lobby, very aware that he was supposedly recreating footage he'd seen 8 hours earlier. He checked his phone at exactly the moment the footage had shown. He walked to the elevators exactly as the footage had shown. He waited, got in. The doors closed. Later, he'd reviewed the security footage from 4:30 p.m. It matched perfectly with what he'd seen at 8:30 a.m. Frame for frame. Identical. He'd lived his life according to a script that had been recorded before it happened. The reports shared a common thread. The phenomenon didn't interact with physical reality directly. It interacted with information, with signals, with the electromagnetic infrastructure that carried time synchronization across the planet. "It's like it doesn't care about matter," James said during one of the briefing sessions. "Only information propagation, only signals." "What kind of intelligence operates that way?" someone asked. No one had an answer, but Rebecca thought about it. An intelligence that only interacted with information. That measured time but ignored matter. That could manipulate signals without touching the physical world. What would that mean? It would mean an intelligence that experienced reality differently than humans did. One that perceived the universe through information flow rather than physical substance. Or it would mean an intelligence so advanced that it didn't need to interact with matter to achieve its goals. That could accomplish everything it needed through pure manipulation of information. Either possibility was terrifying. At 5:37 p.m. according to Rebecca's phone, 4:53 according to the wall clock, and 6:09 according to her laptop, Lee Morrison made an announcement. "We've received confirmation from NIST," she said. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, the organization responsible for maintaining the atomic clocks that defined official time in the United States. For approximately 90 seconds this afternoon, our primary cesium atomic clocks disagreed with each other. Same room, same environmental conditions, same calibration. They showed different times. The room erupted in murmurs. Atomic clocks didn't disagree. That was the point. They measured time based on the fundamental physics of cesium atoms. They were accurate to within nanoseconds over millions of years. "How much deviation?" James asked. 0.37 seconds, Lee said. It didn't sound like much, less than half a second. But for atomic clocks it was impossible. "Something adjusted the rate of atomic decay," Lee said. "Briefly, locally, that shouldn't be possible." "Unless time itself was being calibrated," Rebecca said. Everyone looked at her. "That's what this is," she continued, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. "It's not an attack. It's not a malfunction. Something is synchronizing Earth to an external reference frame. That's why the wave moves at a constant speed. That's why the pattern is identical everywhere. It's calibration. Lee nodded slowly. That's our working theory. But calibration by what? Rebecca asked. For what purpose? We don't know, Lee said, but whatever's doing, it operates at a level of precision we can barely measure. And it's treating our entire planet like a clock that needs to be set. Chapter 6. The moment of realization. Night fell over Portland while Rebecca sat in the conference room, watching data streams, update on monitors, listening to scientists debate theories that sounded like science fiction, but were grounded in empirical measurements that couldn't be dismissed. The wave was completing its passage over the west coast. The temporal deviation graphs showed the characteristic curve approaching its peak. Maximum displacement would occur around midnight. Rebecca's phone showed 8:47 p.m. The wall clock showed 9:33 p.m. Her laptop showed 8:19 p.m. The divergence had reached its maximum. Reality felt loose, untethered. She'd gotten up to get coffee twice, and both times she'd experienced a sensation like déjà vu in reverse. Like she was about to remember something that hadn't happened yet. James was explaining his latest analysis to a group gathered around one of the whiteboards. Rebecca joined them. The key insight is that the disturbance behaves like an external calibration signal, he was saying, drawing diagrams of waves and interference patterns. Think of it like GPS. GPS works because satellites broadcast time signals. Your phone receives signals from multiple satellites, compares the timing, and triangulates your position. The satellites provide the reference frame. So something is broadcasting a reference time signal to Earth? Someone asked. Not exactly. More like something is comparing Earth's time frame to an external standard, measuring the deviation. The wave we're experiencing is the measurement process itself. Why would anyone need to measure Earth's time? James shrugged. Same reason we measure anything. To know where we are, to maintain synchronization with a larger network. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but obvious. A larger network. Rebecca felt cold. You're saying Earth is being synchronized to something bigger, something we're part of whether we know it or not. That's one interpretation, James said carefully. What's the other interpretation? That we're not part of it. We're just in the way. And whatever's doing this is compensating for our presence when it takes measurements. Rebecca sat down, her legs suddenly weak. In the way. Being compensated for. Like obstacles in a survey. Like noise in a signal. Has anyone detected the source, she asked, where the wave originates? That's the problem, Lee said, joining the conversation. It doesn't originate anywhere on Earth. The wave pattern suggests the source is external, probably orbital, possibly significantly beyond orbit. Satellites? We've checked every satellite. Nothing unusual. This is coming from farther out. How far? Lee hesitated. Deep space telemetry stations have detected something. Not a message, not a signal in the conventional sense, but there are periodic timing markers in the cosmic microwave background, intervals that match the periodicity of the temporal wave. Timing markers from where? We don't know. The data is still being analysed, but the intervals appear to be artificial, regular, precise, like a clock ticking. A clock ticking in deep space, Rebecca said. Yes, measuring Earth. Possibly. Rebecca looked at the temporal deviation graph on the nearest monitor. The curve was approaching its peak, the maximum displacement growing minute by minute. What happens at midnight? She asked. The wave completes its passage, Lee said. The deviation returns to baseline. Time realigns. And then? Then we see if it happens again. They didn't have to wait long for the answer. Chapter 7. Human perception lags behind. At 11:49 p.m, according to the battery-powered clock on the conference table, Rebecca experienced something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was standing by the window, looking out at the Portland skyline, when she suddenly remembered a conversation she was about to have. Not predicted, not anticipated, remembered. She remembered Lee walking over to her in approximately 2 minutes, remembered Lee saying, "It's over. The deviation is returning to normal." Remembered her own response, "That's what worries me." She remembered the feeling of dread that would accompany that exchange, the certainty that this wasn't over, that it was just beginning, that humanity had just been measured and found to be, what? Compatible? Incompatible? Useful? Irrelevant? And then, exactly as she'd remembered it, Lee walked over. "It's over," Lee said. "The deviation is returning to normal." Rebecca heard herself say, "That's what worries me." The words came out automatically, spoken by muscle memory of a conversation she'd just experienced in reverse. Lee gave her a strange look. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Rebecca said honestly. I remembered saying that before I said it." "Memory bleed," Lee said quietly. "We've had several reports in the last hour. People experiencing events slightly before they occur. It's a side effect of the temporal gradient. Your perception is briefly out of sync with causality." "It feels wrong," Rebecca said, "like I'm watching myself from outside." "It should stabilize once the wave passes completely." "Should." Rebecca looked at her phone. 11:53. The wall clock. 11:56. Her laptop. 11:51. The devices were converging, slowly. The divergence decreasing as the wave moved on, leaving Earth behind. By 12:15 a.m, all her devices showed the same time within a few seconds. By 12:30, the temporal deviation maps showed green across the entire country. Normal. Synchronized. The wave had passed. People in the conference room started to relax, started to breathe easier. Some began packing up laptops, gathering notes, preparing to leave. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that they'd been weighed and measured by an intelligence that operated on scales they couldn't comprehend, an intelligence that didn't need to announce itself, that didn't need to make contact, that simply needed to know where Earth was in relation to something larger. Chapter 8. The transmission. No one hears. The Deep Space Network station in Goldstone, California, had been recording anomalous data for 72 hours. The news didn't reach the Beaverton facility until Friday morning, after most of the volunteers had gone home, after the immediate crisis had been declared resolved, after official statements had been prepared assuring the public that the temporal irregularities had ceased and posed no ongoing threat. Rebecca was still there, having spent the night on a couch in an unused office, unable to bring herself to leave. She dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check her devices, confirming that time remained synchronized, that the world hadn't slipped again. Lee found her in the conference room around 7 a.m. "You should see this," Lee said. She pulled up a secure feed from Goldstone. Data visualizations that meant nothing to Rebecca at first glance. Waveforms, spectral analyses, numbers scrolling past. "What am I looking at?" Rebecca asked. "Deep space telemetry. Goldstone monitors radio signals from interplanetary spacecraft, but it also listens to background noise. Natural radio emissions from cosmic sources. This is data from the last 3 days." Lee zoomed in on a particular waveform. "This is unusual. These pulses started Tuesday night, same time the temporal wave began on the East Coast. They've continued at regular intervals every 6 hours and 17 minutes since then." What kind of pulses? That's the thing. They're not radio signals in the conventional sense. They're not carrying information. They're just timing markers. Pulses of organized electromagnetic radiation at a frequency that doesn't correspond to any known natural phenomenon. Artificial, Rebecca said. Almost certainly. And here's what makes it relevant. Lee pulled up another graph. This is the temporal deviation wave mapped over time. Notice the periodicity. The wave reaches maximum displacement, then reduces to baseline, then begins building again. The cycle repeats every 6 hours and 17 minutes. Rebecca stared at the graphs. The correlation was exact. The pulses from deep space are synchronized with the temporal wave, she said. Not synchronized, Lee corrected. The pulses precede the wave by approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes, the time it takes light to travel from the sun to Earth. How far away is the source? Rebecca asked. That's what we can't determine. The signal appears to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously, like it's not originating from a point source but from everywhere. That's impossible. Yes, it should be. Unless the source is very large or very far away, or using technology that makes our concept of point sources irrelevant. Rebecca sat down, processing this. What does it mean? We think the pulses are calibration markers, reference points. Imagine you're conducting a survey of a terrain. You set up markers at known positions. Then you measure the terrain relative to those markers. That's what this looks like. Someone is measuring space-time itself, using reference markers we can barely detect. Measuring space-time for what? Navigation, maybe. Cartography, creating a map of the local region of space with extremely high precision. And Earth is part of that map. Earth is a feature in that map, a mass concentration that distorts space-time in a measurable way. The temporal wave is the measurement process. The pulses are the reference frame. Rebecca rubbed her eyes. She'd barely slept. Everything felt surreal. Has anyone told the public about this? She asked. No. The official position is that the temporal irregularities were caused by a previously unknown interaction between GPS satellites and geomagnetic disturbances. Plausible? Technical enough that most people won't question it. But that's not true. No, it's not true. Why lie? Lee was quiet for a moment. Because the truth would cause panic. Because we don't actually know what's happening. Because telling people that an unknown intelligence is measuring Earth from deep space using technology we can't explain would serve no purpose except to create fear. People deserve to know. Maybe. But what would we tell them? We don't know who's doing this. We don't know why. We don't know if they're even aware of us or if we're just an incidental detail in whatever they're mapping. What would you have us say? Rebecca didn't have an answer. Chapter 9. The wave passes. By Friday afternoon, the temporal irregularities had completely resolved. All devices showed synchronized time. GPS worked normally. Traffic systems operated without delays. The news had moved on to other stories, treating the whole event as a minor technological hiccup that had been quickly resolved. Most people who'd experienced the phenomenon shrugged it off. Phones glitch, technology has bugs, life goes on. But for those who'd experienced the causality inversions, who'd received messages from the future or remembered events before they occurred, the resolution felt hollow. Rebecca returned to her apartment in Portland Friday evening. Her phone, laptop, and kitchen clocks all agreed on the time, 6:32 p.m. She made dinner, checked her email, tried to focus on work she'd neglected for 2 days, but she couldn't stop thinking about the timing markers from deep space, the perfect periodicity. The implication that Earth had been measured by something that didn't need to announce its presence. Her phone rang around 9 p.m. Lee. "I wanted to check in," Lee said. "See how you're doing." "I'm fine. Weirded out, but fine." "That's normal. The memory bleed effect should fade over the next few days." "Has there been any more data from Goldstone?" Lee hesitated. "The pulses continue every 6 hours, 17 minutes, like clockwork. So it's not over. The temporal wave has passed Earth. That part is over. But whatever's generating the reference pulses is still active, still broadcasting. Will the wave come back? We don't know. It's possible this was a one-time survey. It's also possible Earth will be measured again, regularly. We have no way to predict." Rebecca looked out her apartment window at the Portland skyline. Lights in buildings, cars on streets, people living their lives, unaware that they'd been catalogued by an intelligence that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. "What do we do?" she asked. "We wait, we monitor, we try to understand. That's all we can do." After Lee hung up, Rebecca sat in the dark, thinking about time. Time had always seemed like an absolute, a constant, the one thing that moved forward inexorably, the same for everyone, everywhere. But now she knew that wasn't true. Time could be manipulated, measured, calibrated from outside. Earth's time was just a local phenomenon, a small eddy in a much larger river, and something out there was measuring that river. Chapter 10. The theory that spreads quietly. The official explanation satisfied most people. Geomagnetic disturbances, GPS anomalies, technical glitches resolved by software updates, and recalibrated systems. But online, in the corners of the internet where people compared notes and shared experiences, a different narrative emerged. It started on Reddit. A post titled, "We weren't contacted, we were checked." The post outlined the theory that the temporal wave wasn't a first contact event, but a survey. That Earth had been measured and catalogued as part of a larger navigation network. That whoever or whatever was creating the deep space timing markers was building a map of local space-time, and Earth was simply one data point among many. The post gained traction. Comments rolled in from people who'd experienced causality inversions, who'd received impossible messages, who'd watched their clocks disagree in patterns that suggested external interference. Someone linked to the Goldstone data that had been leaked by a technician who couldn't keep quiet. The timing pulses, the perfect 6-hour 17-minute periodicity, the correlation with the temporal wave. Another person analysed the data and noticed something else. The interval of 6 hours 17 minutes wasn't random. It was exactly 1/10,000th of the orbital period of Earth around the Sun. Someone was measuring Earth's orbit precisely, continuously. The theory evolved. Earth wasn't being contacted because contact implied communication between equals. This was something else. This was infrastructure. Imagine building a highway system. You survey the terrain. You measure elevations, soil composition, existing features. You don't contact the anthills or consult with the rabbits. You just measure. You account for obstacles. You build around them or through them depending on their significance. What if Earth was an anthill in someone else's highway system? The theory spread through conspiracy forums, through UFO discussion groups, through science communities that took it more seriously than they wanted to admit. Some people found it comforting. At least they'd noticed us. At least we were significant enough to measure. Others found it terrifying, because if we were just features in a map, obstacles to be noted and routed around, then our entire existence might be irrelevant to whatever was doing the measuring. Rebecca followed the discussions obsessively For weeks, she'd become semi-famous in these circles as one of the verified causality inversion cases. People asked her questions, wanted her take on new theories, treated her like an expert on something no one understood. She didn't feel like an expert. She felt like someone who'd glimpsed something vast and incomprehensible and was now trying to explain it with inadequate vocabulary. But she kept trying, because the alternative was to pretend it hadn't happened, to accept the official explanation and move on with her life. And she couldn't do that. Not after hearing her own voice from the future. Not after remembering conversations before they occurred. Not after learning that Earth had been measured by an intelligence that didn't need to announce itself. The temporal wave didn't return. Not in the weeks following the initial event, not in the months after, but the timing pulses from deep space continued. Regular, predictable, unmistakable, every 6 hours and 17 minutes. Like a clock ticking in the darkness between stars. Measuring, always measuring. Epilogue. The time we almost noticed. It's been 6 months since the temporal wave passed over Earth. Rebecca still checks her devices compulsively, comparing the times, looking for discrepancies that never appear anymore. Her phone and laptop and kitchen clocks remain synchronized. Time flows forward uniformly, the way it's supposed to. But she knows the truth now. Time on Earth is synchronized, not because it's absolute, but because something external maintains that synchronization. The timing pulses from deep space continue. The calibration markers persist. Earth exists within a network we didn't build and don't control. Most people have forgotten about the temporal irregularities. It's been reclassified in collective memory as a weird technical glitch from last year, something to mention at parties as a curious footnote. Remember when all our clocks went haywire for a few days? That was strange. But for those who experienced the causality inversions, who felt time become subjective and unstable, the memory remains sharp. They know that contact doesn't require ships descending from the sky. It doesn't require messages or declarations or any of the dramatic scenarios from science fiction. Contact can be subtle, invisible, a calibration of systems we depend on but don't fully understand. If something can adjust our clocks, it doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to measure. And measuring is exactly what something has been doing. Rebecca thinks about this late at night, when she can't sleep, when she lies awake listening to the silence and imagining the timing pulses propagating through the void, marking intervals in space-time with inhuman precision. She thinks about highways through terrain, about surveys that note obstacles, about infrastructure projects conducted at scales that make planets seem insignificant. She thinks about the fact that we almost noticed. Almost, but not quite. The temporal wave came and went, leaving behind questions we're not equipped to answer, and measurements we're only beginning to understand. Maybe that was the point. Maybe we were supposed to almost notice, supposed to catch a glimpse of something larger, supposed to realize we're part of a cosmos more complex and inhabited than we imagined. Or maybe we weren't supposed to notice at all. Maybe the fact that we did notice is an accident, a glitch in their system rather than ours. Either way, the measuring continues. The timing pulses propagate. Earth orbits the sun, while something watches from the dark, maintaining calibration, ensuring synchronization, treating our entire world like a clock that occasionally needs adjustment. We live our lives in the spaces between measurements, in the intervals when time flows normally, and we can pretend we're alone. But every 6 hours and 17 minutes, something checks, and we're reminded, whether we acknowledge it or not, that we exist within systems we didn't create, That we're being watched by means we can barely detect. That contact already happened. We just didn't recognize it because it didn't announce itself with lights in the sky or messages from beyond. It announced itself through our clocks running late, through timestamps that didn't match, through the infrastructure we built to measure time, revealing that time itself was being measured by something else. And that's more terrifying than any invasion, because invasions can be resisted. But how do you resist being measured? How do you fight back against calibration? You can't. You can only wait for the next measurement and wonder what they're building and hope that when the project is complete, there's still a place for us in whatever comes next. Rebecca Torres goes to work, comes home, lives her life, but she always checks her devices, always compares the times, always remembers the day the signals arrived late, the day we almost noticed we weren't alone, the day time itself proved to be less stable than we believed. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, something continues to measure, precisely, relentlessly, indifferently, tick, tick, tick. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a tremendous difference in helping others discover these stories. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. The quiet signal. A UFO encounter that was never meant to be seen. There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary without warning. No fanfare, no dramatic build-up, just a quiet shift in reality that leaves you questioning everything you thought you understood about the world around you. This is not the story of a believer searching the skies for confirmation. This is not the testimony of someone who spent their nights hoping for contact. This is the account of someone who experienced something impossible during the most mundane moment of their life, in a place where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. What you're about to hear is documented through personal testimony, corroborated sighting reports, and electromagnetic interference logs that were never meant to be connected. This is the story of an encounter that arrived without sound, departed without explanation, and left behind only questions that refused to fade. This is the quiet signal. Chapter 1. A routine that breaks. The high desert of Nevada holds a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that feels almost deliberate. During the day, the landscape bakes under relentless sun. At night, temperatures plummet, and the darkness becomes so complete that the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light. Marcus Webb had lived on his property outside of Tonopah for 11 years. A former telecommunications technician, he had purchased the 40-acre plot specifically for its isolation. No neighbours within 5 miles, No city lights to pollute the night sky. Just sagebrush, Joshua trees, and the kind of quiet that most people find uncomfortable. Every night, Marcus followed the same routine. Around 10 in the evening, he would walk the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and ensuring his small flock of chickens had been secured for the night. The walk took approximately 45 minutes. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every angle of the landscape by heart. On the night of October 17th, 2023, Marcus began his walk as usual. The temperature had dropped to the mid-40s. Clear sky. No moon. The kind of night where you could see satellites crossing overhead like slow-moving stars. He had walked this route hundreds of times. He knew exactly how the starlight would catch on the distant mountains. He knew which parts of the fence needed extra attention. He knew the sounds of the desert at night, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant cry of coyotes. Everything felt normal. The stars were visible in their usual configurations. Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper hanging low in the north. Marcus wasn't an astronomy enthusiast, but he knew the sky well enough to notice if something was out of place. He was approximately 20 minutes into his walk when the first change occurred. It was subtle, so subtle that he almost didn't register it. The ambient sound of the desert, the faint whisper of wind through sage, the distant insect chirps, all of it stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Marcus paused mid-step, suddenly aware of the absolute silence surrounding him. He had experienced quiet nights before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. He stood motionless, listening. Nothing. Then he noticed the second anomaly. The wind had stopped completely, not died down, stopped. The sagebrush around him stood perfectly still. In 11 years on this property, Marcus had never experienced a night with zero air movement. There was always some breeze, however faint, moving across the open desert. He felt a pressure building in his ears, similar to the sensation of rapid altitude change. His pulse quickened slightly, though he couldn't identify why. Nothing visible had changed. The stars remained steady overhead. The landscape looked exactly as it should. But something fundamental had shifted in the environment around him. Marcus continued walking, telling himself he was being irrational. Probably a pressure system moving in. Unusual atmospheric conditions, nothing more. He made it another 100 yards before he saw the light. Chapter 2. The First Anomaly. The light appeared without warning in the southern sky, roughly 30 degrees above the horizon. It was not bright, not dramatic. In fact, Marcus almost missed it entirely because it resembled a star at first glance. But stars don't appear suddenly. They're either visible or they're not. This light had materialized in a portion of sky that had been empty moments before. Marcus stopped walking and focused on the light. It remained stationary, perfectly still. No blinking, no movement, just a steady, pale amber glow that seemed slightly larger than Venus at its brightest. His first thought was satellite, but satellites move. They cross the sky in steady arcs, taking several minutes to traverse from horizon to horizon. This light wasn't moving at all. His second thought was aircraft, but there was no sound, no engine noise, no navigation lights. Commercial flights often passed over this region, en route between Las Vegas and points north. He was familiar with how they looked. This wasn't that. Could be a drone, he reasoned. Some kind of high-altitude surveillance platform. The military operated out of several installations in Nevada. Unmanned vehicles were common in the area, but drones made noise. Even at significant altitude, you could hear them, and they typically displayed some kind of lighting pattern to maintain FAA compliance. This light was completely silent. Marcus watched it for what he estimated to be 5 minutes, though he later couldn't be certain. Time had begun to feel strange, elastic. Minutes seemed to compress and expand without warning. The light remained absolutely stationary. Then it moved. Not in the way aircraft move, with smooth transitions and predictable trajectories. This movement was instantaneous. The light was in one position, and then, without travelling the distance between, it was in another position, approximately 10 degrees to the east. No acceleration. No blur. Just immediate relocation. Marcus felt his stomach, his tighten. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't operating under normal physics. Objects don't teleport. They move through space in continuous motion. He considered going back to the house, getting his binoculars, maybe his camera, but something stopped him. A strange reluctance to take his eyes off the light, as if looking away might cause him to lose track of it entirely. The pressure in his ears increased. His hands felt cold despite the gloves he was wearing. The light remained in its new position for several more minutes. Then Marcus made a decision that he would later struggle to explain. He started walking directly toward it. Chapter 3. The Light Responds. Marcus moved south across his property, keeping his eyes fixed on the light. The terrain sloped gently downward, leading toward a dry creek bed that marked the southern boundary of his land. As he walked, the light remained stationary. Then, when he was approximately 50 yards from his starting position, it moved again. Same instantaneous relocation. This time shifting back to the west, maintaining roughly the same distance from his position. Marcus stopped. The light stopped. He took several steps to the left. The light adjusted its position, a subtle shift that seemed to compensate for his movement. It was tracking him. Not aggressively, not in a threatening manner, but deliberately, as if maintaining a specific distance and angle relative to his position. Marcus stood completely still, his mind racing through possibilities. Sophisticated drone, military surveillance, some kind of experimental aircraft using technology he wasn't aware of. None of those explanations felt adequate. He raised his right hand slowly, extending it toward the light. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the light pulsed once, a brief intensification of its luminosity, lasting perhaps half a second. Marcus lowered his hand. The light returned to its steady glow. He raised his hand again. Another pulse. Same duration, same intensity. It was responding to him. Marcus felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Whatever was generating that light was aware of his presence and was reacting to his actions. He began to feel something else. Not fear exactly. More like profound confusion, mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. As if some part of his mind recognized what was happening, even though his conscious thoughts couldn't process it. Time continued to behave strangely. He had no idea how long he had been standing there. It could have been minutes or hours. The normal reference points he used to track time, the gradual movement of stars across the sky, the cooling of the night air, all seemed unreliable. Then he noticed the second object. Chapter 4. The Second Layer. At first, Marcus thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A dark spot in the sky slightly north of the light, but it wasn't moving. And it wasn't like looking at empty space. He had spent years looking at the night sky. He knew what darkness looked like between stars. This was different. This was an absence, a void, a region where stars that should have been visible simply weren't. As his eyes adjusted, the shape became more defined. It was massive, roughly triangular, or perhaps diamond-shaped. Difficult to determine exact geometry because it was only visible in silhouette, blocking the stars behind it. the object was completely dark. No lights, no surface features visible, just a black mass suspended in the sky. Marcus estimated it to be at least the size of a football field, though without knowing its exact altitude, accurate size calculation was impossible. The amber light he had been watching was positioned at what appeared to be the forward point of this dark mass, not attached exactly, more like hovering several hundred feet in front of it. The light wasn't the object, it was a marker, a reference point, something to draw attention while the actual craft remained nearly invisible against the night sky. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. This wasn't a drone. This wasn't any kind of conventional aircraft. This was something else entirely. The dark mass remained perfectly still. No sound, no visible propulsion, no heat shimmer or distortion of the stars around it. He tried to estimate altitude. Based on the angular size and assuming the object was as large as it appeared, it had to be at least 2,000 feet up, maybe higher. At that altitude, any conventional aircraft would be clearly audible. Helicopters, planes, jets, they all generated significant noise that carried for miles across open desert. This made no sound at all. Marcus became aware of a new sensation, a feeling of weight pressing down on him. Not physical pressure, but something else, a presence, the distinct impression that he was being observed with the same intensity he was observing the object. His thoughts began to feel strange, fragmented. Ideas would start and then slip away before reaching completion. He tried to focus on practical concerns, what to do next, whether to document this somehow, but his mind kept drifting. The pressure in his ears intensified until it became almost painful. Then the light began to pulse. Chapter 5. The signal. The pulsing wasn't regular. It wasn't like a beacon or a warning light. The intervals varied. 3 short pulses, then a long pause. 2 pulses, another pause of different duration. A single pulse. Extended pause. Marcus tried to find a pattern, some kind of sequence or code. But if there was structure to it, it remained beyond his ability to decipher. As he watched the pulsing light, something began happening in his mind. Thoughts that didn't feel like his own started emerging. Not words, not voices. Something more fundamental. Concepts, understanding, arriving fully formed without the usual process of reasoning or deduction. He suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the object was not a threat. The knowledge simply appeared in his consciousness, solid and unquestionable. He knew that what he was experiencing was not unique to him, that others had stood in similar places, at similar times watching similar lights, that this had been happening for a very long time. He knew that the object was old, not ancient in the archaeological sense, but old in a way that made human civilization seem brief and recent. These weren't thoughts he was thinking. They were information being placed directly into his awareness. Fragments of memory began surfacing. Childhood moments he hadn't thought about in decades. The face of his grandmother, who had passed 20 years ago. The specific smell of rain on desert sand. Random, disconnected pieces of his personal history rising to consciousness without prompt. Along with these memories came others that didn't belong to him. Brief flashes of perspective that weren't his own. Looking down at Earth from very high altitude, observing cities of light against dark continents, watching weather systems swirl in accelerated time. Marcus tried to resist the intrusion, but there was nothing to resist against. The information simply flowed into his mind like water finding its level. He became aware of vast distances, scales of space and time that made his entire existence feel like a single breath. The understanding that Earth was one of countless observation points, that contact, when it occurred, was rarely direct, that most encounters were passive, observational, data collection without intervention. The realization struck him that he wasn't experiencing communication. He was experiencing something more like calibration, as if his presence at this specific location and time had created some kind of intersection, a momentary overlap between two entirely different forms of consciousness. The pulsing continued. The pressure in his head intensified until it felt like his skull might crack. Then, without warning, it stopped. Chapter 6. Missing Continuity. Marcus became aware of himself gradually, like waking from deep sleep. He was sitting on the ground. He had no memory of sitting down. The sky had changed. The stars had rotated. Orion, which had been rising in the east when he started his walk, was now high overhead. The Big Dipper had shifted significantly in its position. Hours had passed. Marcus looked at his watch. The digital display read 2:15 in the morning. Impossible. He had started his walk at 10. Even accounting for the time he had spent observing the light, it couldn't be past midnight. An hour, maybe 90 minutes at most. Over 4 hours had elapsed. He looked up. The sky was empty. No light, no dark mass, nothing but stars and the faint glow of the Milky Way. The silence had ended. He could hear wind moving through the sage again, distant coyotes calling, the normal sounds of the desert at night. Marcus stood slowly. His legs felt stiff as if he had been sitting in the same position for a long time. His hands were numb with cold. He was approximately 300 yards from where he had first seen the light. He had no memory of walking this far. The ground around him was covered in dew. His clothing was damp. The moisture suggested he had been motionless for hours while condensation formed on the fabric. He tried to reconstruct the missing time. After the pulsing stopped, what happened next? Had he watched the object depart? Had it simply vanished? When did he sit down? Why did he sit down? The memories refused to form. There was a clear before, the period of observation, and the strange information flowing into his mind. And there was a clear after, the moment of regaining awareness, sitting on cold ground. But the transition between those states was gone, erased, a clean gap in continuity. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He bent forward. Hands on his knees, breathing slowly until the sensation passed. When he straightened up, he noticed something else. His phone was in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out of his pocket. The screen was on, displaying the camera app. According to the timestamp, the app had been active for over 2 hours, but there were no photos in his gallery, no videos. The camera had been running, aimed at nothing, saving nothing. Marcus turned off the phone and put it back in his pocket. He began walking back toward his house, moving carefully across the uneven terrain. Every few steps he would stop and look up, scanning the sky for any sign of the light or the dark mass. Nothing, just stars and empty space. By the time he reached his house, the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. He had lost an entire night. Chapter 7. The After Effects. Marcus spent the following day in a state of exhausted confusion. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours, fitful and interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He tried to approach the experience rationally. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and attempted to document everything he could recall. The timeline, the observations, the sensations. But when he tried to describe the period when information had been flowing into his mind, he found the memories slippery, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you try to articulate it. He knew things had been communicated. He knew he had understood something profound, but the specific content refused to solidify into language. Over the next several days, Marcus noticed other changes. His digital watch stopped working. the display would glitch, showing impossible times or strings of random numbers. He replaced the battery twice before finally accepting the device was malfunctioning beyond repair. His laptop experienced similar issues: random crashes, programs opening on their own, the Wi-Fi connection dropping repeatedly despite his router showing full functionality. The problems were brief, lasting only about a week before electronic devices began functioning normally again. But during that period, technology seemed unreliable in ways that defied simple explanation. His sleep became irregular, not insomnia exactly, but a disruption of his normal patterns. He would feel exhausted at odd hours, wide awake when he should have been tired. His circadian rhythm had been knocked off balance. Certain sounds began causing strong reactions. The hum of electrical transformers, the specific frequency of wind moving across power lines, high-pitched tones at the edge of hearing. These sounds would trigger brief moments of vertigo and the sensation of being watched. Marcus told no one about the encounter, not because he feared ridicule. He had lived long enough to be indifferent to others' opinions, but because discussing it felt wrong somehow, like talking about it would diminish the experience or invite attention he didn't want. There was also the matter of what he would say. How do you describe missing time? How do you explain knowledge that appeared in your mind without source? How do you convey the certainty that you were observed by something utterly foreign to human experience? He continued his nightly walks, following the same route. Part of him hoped for a repeat encounter. Part of him dreaded it. The sky remained normal. Stars, satellites, occasional aircraft with their blinking navigation lights. Nothing unusual appeared, but the sense remained that something unfinished had occurred, as if the encounter on October 17th had been an introduction, not a conclusion. 3 weeks passed before Marcus discovered he wasn't alone in what he had experienced. Chapter 8: Subtle Confirmations. Marcus made the discovery by accident. He had driven into Tonopah for supplies, stopping at the small general store that served the rural community. While waiting in line, he overheard 2 local ranchers talking. One was describing interference with his radio equipment. Multiple nights over the past month, strange patterns of static that would last for hours and then suddenly stop. The other mentioned his wife had seen unusual lights south of their property. Wouldn't talk much about it. Seemed disturbed by the experience. Marcus didn't interrupt the conversation, but afterward, he began paying attention to local talk with new interest. A comment from a gas station attendant about her dog refusing to go outside for 3 nights straight, just standing at the door and whining. A mention in the local weekly newspaper about residents reporting power fluctuations and electronic interference during the second week of October. A post on a regional online forum describing a large dark shape blocking stars observed from a location 30 miles west of Tonopah. None of the accounts were detailed, none explicitly described the same event Marcus had experienced, but there were consistent elements: silence during the encounters, a sense of time distortion, electronic interference in the days following, and notably, a reluctance to discuss the experiences in detail. Marcus began researching historical reports from the area. Tonopah had a long association with military testing and unusual aerial phenomena. The region had been used for classified aircraft development for decades, but the sightings he was finding didn't match standard explanations of experimental aircraft. The descriptions were too consistent across too many years. Lights that responded to observers, objects that moved in physically impossible ways, encounters that left witnesses confused rather than frightened. He found a reference to a Department of Energy report from 1998 documenting unexplained electromagnetic interference at a monitoring station approximately 40 miles from his property. The interference occurred in irregular patterns over a 3-month period and then ceased completely. No cause was ever determined. He found testimony from a former air traffic controller describing radar contacts that would appear and disappear without explanation. Objects that would accelerate beyond the capability of any known aircraft. The controller had filed reports. Nothing had come of them. He found a letter to the editor in a 1976 issue of the local paper, written by a resident describing an encounter nearly identical to what Marcus had experienced. The letter writer described missing time, electronic disturbances, and a profound sense that they had been observed by something non-human. The accumulated evidence suggested a pattern of activity stretching back decades. Periodic encounters, passive observation, minimal interaction, no hostility, no obvious purpose. Marcus realized he was part of something ongoing. Whatever had observed him on October 17th had been observing this region for a very long time. The question wasn't whether the encounters were real, the question was what they meant. Chapter 9. Reframing the encounter. Marcus spent considerable time thinking about frameworks, ways to understand what had happened to him. The popular conception of alien contact involved communication, messages, warning about nuclear weapons or environmental destruction, offers of technology or spiritual enlightenment, dramatic interaction with clear purpose. His experience had been nothing like that. There had been no message, no warning, no attempt at meaningful exchange, just observation, the collection of data, a momentary intersection between two forms of awareness that operated on completely different scales. He began thinking about his own experience observing wildlife. How many times had he watched birds or rabbits on his property without any desire to interact? He was simply noting their presence, their behaviour, their patterns. Perhaps that was closer to what had happened. Not first contact, not communication, just observation by something that regarded humans the way humans might regard interesting but limited creatures. The thought was humbling and strangely liberating. It suggested the encounters weren't about humanity at all. We weren't the focus. We were simply part of the landscape being observed. The information that had flowed into his mind during the encounter, the sense of vast distances and ancient perspectives, supported this interpretation. Whatever had observed him existed on scales of time and space that made human concerns essentially irrelevant. They weren't here to save us or destroy us or guide us. They were here to watch, to document, to collect data from countless worlds across spans of time humans couldn't comprehend. Most encounters, Marcus now believed, were probably passive. Brief overlaps, moments when observation systems became visible to those being observed. The silence made sense in this context. Why would you announce your presence when your purpose was simply to watch? The missing time made sense. If the observation involved detailed scanning or data collection, the process might require extended periods. The human mind, unable to process or remember such alien procedures, would simply skip over them, creating gaps, clean breaks in continuity. The electronic interference made sense as a side effect. Technologies designed to operate on entirely different principles might generate electromagnetic signatures that disrupted human electronics as a simple byproduct of their function. Even the reluctance to discuss the encounters made sense. Some part of the human mind recognized these experiences as different from normal reality, set apart, not to be integrated into regular conversation or normal life. Marcus realized he would probably never understand the full purpose of what had happened to him. The gap between human consciousness and whatever intelligence had observed him was too vast, but understanding the purpose wasn't necessary. The encounter had happened. It was real. It had been documented in his memory, in the subtle confirmations he had discovered, in the pattern of similar events stretching across decades. That was enough. Epilogue. The signal remains. 4 months after the encounter, Marcus returned to the location where he had regained awareness, sitting on the cold ground. It was February. Clear night, temperature near freezing. The same profound silence that characterized the high desert in winter. He stood in the exact spot, looking up at the southern sky. Nothing unusual appeared. The stars moved in their normal patterns. A satellite crossed overhead, following its predictable arc from horizon to horizon. Distant aircraft lights blinked in standard navigation patterns. The sky looked completely ordinary. But as Marcus stood there, he felt something. Not presence, not observation, just a faint recognition. As if the location itself remembered what had happened. He thought about all the people who had stood in similar places, looking up at similar skies, experiencing similar encounters, scattered across the world, across decades, perhaps across centuries, all of them returning to normal life, carrying memories of something that refused to fit into standard explanations. All of them knowing they had experienced something real, while lacking the language or framework to fully describe it. Marcus looked up at the stars for a long time. Then he walked back to his house, following the same path he walked every night. The routine had resumed. Life had returned to normal patterns. But something fundamental had changed in how he understood his place in the universe. He was not alone in the cosmos. Earth was not unobserved. Human activity was being documented by intelligences that operated beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, rarely, the watchers became visible, not to communicate, not to intervene, just to remind us that we're seen. The encounter was over. The object had departed. The missing hours would never be recovered, but the signal remained. A quiet certainty that something vast and ancient had taken note of one human being on one night in the Nevada desert, and perhaps in ways he would never understand, was still watching. The stars continued their eternal rotation. The desert maintained its silence, and Marcus Webb carried on with his life, changed by an encounter that was never meant to be understood, only remembered. There are moments in history when everything changes, yet nothing moves. No explosions, no dramatic arrivals, no lights descending from the heavens. Just a subtle shift in the fabric of reality that most people never notice. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when humanity stopped shouting into the void and realized with creeping horror that the void had been listening all along. Late October in northern Canada, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and silence absolute. The Whitehorse Deep Space Monitoring Station sat like a forgotten monument to an earlier era of space exploration. Its white geodesic dome cracked and weathered, its parking lot empty except for a single truck with failing heating. Inside, Elliot Crane sat alone. The station was scheduled for permanent closure in 3 weeks. Most of its equipment had already been powered down, the important instruments relocated to newer facilities with better funding and warmer climates. What remained was essentially archaeological: outdated receivers, analog recording equipment, systems that had been state-of-the-art when Elliot was in elementary school. Elliot himself was an artifact of sorts, a systems technician in his early 40s who preferred the company of machines to people. He had volunteered for this final assignment precisely because it meant solitude. 3 weeks of checking systems, logging data, and ensuring everything was properly archived before the lights went out forever. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be safe. On the evening of October 23rd, Elliot performed his standard overnight systems check. This involved walking through the station's main monitoring room, a circular space beneath the dome where banks of equipment hummed and clicked with the mechanical rhythm of a dying era. Most screens were dark, most consoles were silent, only one system remained fully active: the wide-band cosmic background receiver, designated Unit 7. Its sole purpose was to log random cosmic noise, the constant static hiss of the universe itself. This data served as a baseline for calibration, nothing more. It was not analysed, it was barely noticed. Until the noise stopped. Elliot first noticed it at 23 minutes past 11. He'd been reviewing temperature logs when something about the monitoring room felt different. Not wrong exactly, just different. Then he realised what it was. The white noise hiss from Unit 7's speakers had changed. For decades, that hiss had been constant, random, chaotic in the way that natural phenomena always are. But now it sounded uniform, smooth, like a single sustained note instead of static. Elliot walked to the console and stared at the display. Every frequency band showed identical activity, perfect uniformity across the entire spectrum. This was impossible. Cosmic background radiation is chaotic by definition. Radio waves from distant stars, particle collisions, quantum, fluctuations, all of it creates a random pattern that never synchronizes. It is one of the few constants in astrophysics. The universe is fundamentally noisy. But on October 23rd, at 23 minutes past 11, the universe went quiet in the most disturbing way possible. Not silent, just uniform. Elliot's first assumption was equipment failure, a stuck relay, a corrupted data stream, something prosaic and fixable. He ran diagnostics. Every system reported normal operation. Signal strength, normal. Antenna positioning, normal. Data processing, normal. The equipment was working perfectly. It was reality that had changed. Elliot sat in the uncomfortable chair, bolted to the monitoring station floor, and stared at the screens. His breath made small clouds in the poorly heated room. Outside, wind rattled the dome with a sound like distant drums. He needed to confirm the system was actually functioning. There was a standard procedure for this, a calibration pulse, a short automated signal transmitted to check timing accuracy. It lasted milliseconds. It was not directional. It was not powerful. It was not meant to accomplish anything except verify that clocks were synchronized. Elliot initiated the pulse at 11:37. The system transmitted a brief chirp of organized radio energy encoded with timing data, then silence. Well, not silence. The uniform hiss continued unchanged. Elliot logged the calibration and turned back to his temperature reports. 8 seconds later, the noise returned. Not the uniform hiss, the real noise, the chaotic, random static of cosmic background radiation, but it returned shaped. Elliot's attention snapped to the display. The signal pattern scrolling across the screen was not random. It was structured. It mirrored the calibration pulse he had just transmitted, but stretched, layered, and harmonically complex, as if something had received his transmission and answered. Elliot's hands were shaking as he saved the data. He played it back 3 times, checking for artifacts, for errors, for anything that would explain what he was seeing. The pattern remained consistent. A response, not a reflection. The timing was wrong for that, not an echo. The structure was too deliberately altered. Something had processed his signal and transmitted a reply. Elliot spent the next hour documenting everything. Exact timestamps, signal characteristics, environmental conditions. He worked with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to think about implications. At 1:15 in the morning, he composed an email to his supervisor, a station manager named Patricia Voss, who worked from an office in Ottawa and had made it clear she considered this entire closure operation a bureaucratic formality. The email was brief, professional. It included all relevant data attachments and a simple request for guidance on whether to repeat the calibration test. Patricia's reply arrived at 1:43. 4 words. Do not repeat test. No explanation. No curiosity. No questions. Just a warning. Elliot stared at those 4 words for a long time. He had worked in government contracting long enough to recognise the tone. This was not the response of someone dismissing a technical glitch. This was the response of someone who recognised something they did not want to acknowledge. He shut down his workstation and walked to the break room. The coffee was hours old and tasted like rust, but he drank it anyway, standing by the window that looked out over kilometres of snow-covered emptiness. Somewhere above that emptiness, something had answered humanity's accidental whisper, and someone in Ottawa already knew what that meant. Elliot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the monitoring room, watching Unit 7's displays, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The cosmic background noise remained normal, random, chaotic, as if the 8 seconds of impossible response had never occurred. By morning, Elliot had convinced himself he was overreacting. Equipment did strange things. Data did unexpected things. The universe was full of phenomena that seemed impossible until they were explained. But he could not quite dismiss the flatness of Patricia's response. At 9 in the morning, ignoring the explicit instruction he had received, Elliot composed an email to someone who might actually be curious. Marcus Webb had been a colleague years ago, back when Elliot worked at a university research facility. Marcus had moved into academic signal analysis, studying radio patterns from pulsars and using them to test theories about information transmission across cosmic distances. More importantly, Marcus was genuinely interested in anomalies. Elliot's email was casual. He framed it as an interesting curiosity, something weird that happened during equipment shutdown. He attached the data. Marcus replied within 6 hours. The message was 3 sentences long. This is not reflection. This is transformation. Something processed your signal. Elliot called him immediately. Marcus answered on the second ring. Where did you get this data? The Whitehorse station, background monitoring. I ran a calibration pulse and got this response 8 seconds later. 8 seconds exactly. To the millisecond. Silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful. "Elliot, this is not noise. This is structure. Whatever generated this signal took your calibration pulse, analysed it, and returned a harmonically evolved version. That requires processing, intelligence, or a very weird equipment malfunction. Does equipment failure usually create mathematically precise harmonic transformations?" Elliot had no answer for that. Marcus continued, "Have you checked historical data? Has this happened before?" "I was told not to investigate further." "By whom?" "My supervisor." Another pause. "That is extremely interesting." That evening, Elliot did something he knew he should not do. He accessed the station's archived logs, going back decades, searching for any mention of similar anomalies. The logs were extensive, thousands of entries documenting routine operations, equipment maintenance, calibration tests, and background noise characteristics. Most were unremarkable, but buried in the data, appearing roughly every 10 to 15 years, were brief notations that made Elliot's stomach tighten. August of 2008. Background synchronization event. Duration 4 seconds. No source identified. November of 1993. Unexplained signal uniformity. Investigated. Equipment normal. Event ceased. June of 1978. Cosmic noise collapse. Brief. Resolved without intervention. Each time the same pattern. A short period of impossible uniformity. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a note in the logs, and then nothing. The events had been dismissed because they were brief, because they resolved themselves, and because nothing else happened. Until now. Elliot printed the relevant log entries and spread them across the break room table. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every decade or so, something caused the cosmic background to synchronize briefly. And every time, the event was ignored, filed away, forgotten. Why? Because following up would mean acknowledging something impossible. And acknowledging something impossible would mean consequences, questions, attention. Much easier to log it and move on. Elliot returned to the monitoring room and pulled up the most recent data from Unit 7. The cosmic background noise was behaving normally, random fluctuations across all frequency bands. He initiated another calibration pulse. He did not ask permission. The pulse transmitted at 22 minutes past midnight. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it was different. The signal did not simply mirror the calibration pulse, it evolved. The harmonic structure was more complex, the timing more precise. It was as if whatever was responding had learned from the first exchange, as if it understood better now. Elliot recorded everything. He sent the data to Marcus. He saved multiple backups, and then he waited. The response came again the next night, without any calibration pulse from his end. At exactly 8 seconds past midnight, Unit 7 registered a signal, identical in structure to the responses he had recorded, but unprompted, as if whatever was out there had decided to initiate contact on its own terms. Elliot documented it all. The signals were evolving, not words, not symbols, nothing that resembled human communication. Instead, they showed timing shifts, harmonic layering, patterns that breathed, expanding and contracting like something alive. It was communication without language, structure without syntax, as if the intelligence behind the signals did not understand sound the way humans did. It only understood structure, pattern, relationship. Marcus called him at 2 a.m. "I have been analysing the data you sent. Elliot, this signal is not coming from space." "What do you mean?" "The propagation characteristics are wrong. If this were a distant source, we would see dispersion, delay, degradation. This signal has none of that. It is appearing simultaneously across multiple frequency bands with no time lag. That is impossible. Yes, which means our assumptions are wrong. This is not a transmission from a point source. It is something else. Like what? I do not know, but I checked something. I accessed archived data from other monitoring stations, deep-sea cable noise logs, old radio astronomy recordings. Elliot, the pattern appears everywhere. Brief moments of signal synchronization, going back decades, always dismissed as interference, always ignored. Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying this encounter is not local. It is global. Whatever is responding has been present for a very long time. We just never noticed. That night, Elliot barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of vast patterns moving through empty space, invisible and patient, waiting for the right signal to finally respond. The next morning, he arrived at the station to find his access credentials had been revoked. The door lock blinked red when he tried his keycard. He called Patricia. She answered immediately. Elliot, you have been removed from this assignment effective immediately. Why? Equipment irregularities. Your access is a liability. What irregularities? That is not your concern anymore. Report to Ottawa for reassignment. Patricia, something is responding to our signals. You know that. The logs prove it has happened before. Silence. Then Patricia spoke, her voice very quiet. Elliot, this station is closing. The data will be archived. The equipment will be decommissioned. Whatever you think you observed will be noted in the final report as a calibration anomaly. You need to let this go. Why? Because some questions do not have good answers, and some answers do not lead anywhere useful. The call ended. Elliot sat in his truck, engine running for warmth, staring at the station he could no longer enter. 48 hours after he first noticed the signal, his entire investigation had been shut down. His access revoked, his findings dismissed, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. That evening, Marcus called with more information. I contacted colleagues at other institutions. Everyone has similar data. Brief periods of signal uniformity. Always dismissed. Always filed away. But Elliot, there is a pattern to when it happens. What pattern? It correlates with advances in global timing technology, GPS satellites, international atomic clock synchronization, fiber optic networks with microsecond timing precision. Every time humanity's technology becomes more temporally synchronized, these events increase in frequency. Why would that matter? Because maybe timing is the language. Maybe this intelligence does not communicate through meaning or symbols. It communicates through structure. And for decades, our signals were too chaotic, too random. But modern technology changed that. We created global timing standards, synchronized clocks, uniform protocols. We finally spoke in a way this presence could recognize. Not intentionally. No, but inevitably. Elliot understood then what had happened. Humanity had not made first contact through deliberate effort, not through SETI, not through carefully composed messages beamed toward distant stars. Instead, contact had occurred as an accident of infrastructure. We built systems that required precise timing, and something noticed, something that existed not as a craft or a being, but as a distributed presence, something that lived in fields, not bodies, something that did not travel, because it was already everywhere, woven into the fabric of electromagnetic reality itself, waiting, listening, until humanity finally spoke clearly enough to be understood. Elliot never returned to the White Horse Station. It was shut down 2 weeks later. The equipment was decommissioned. The data was archived in locations he did not have clearance to access. Officially, the anomalous signals were classified as equipment malfunction, interference, calibration errors. Unofficially, nothing was said at all. But Elliot kept monitoring. Not through official channels, not through government equipment, through publicly available data, radio astronomy archives, deep space monitoring reports, amateur satellite tracking forums. And over the following months, he noticed something. The cosmic background noise was changing, subtly, so subtly that most monitoring systems filtered it out as irrelevant. But it was there, faint patterns, recurring structures, harmonic relationships that should not exist in random noise. The universe sounded organized. Elliot shared his findings with Marcus, who confirmed it independently. "It is everywhere," Marcus said. "Not loud, not obvious, but consistent, as if something is actively maintaining structure in what should be chaos." What does that mean? It means we were noticed, and whatever noticed us is still paying attention. There were no sightings, no lights in the sky, no silver discs hovering over cities. Contact did not arrive in any form humanity had imagined. Instead, it manifested as awareness. Something vast and patient had heard humanity's accidental signal, and instead of visiting, instead of revealing itself, it had simply acknowledged our existence, and now it was listening. Elliot thought about this often, late at night when the world was quiet and he could almost hear the hum of electromagnetic fields carrying signals across the globe. Humanity had spent decades broadcasting into space, hoping for a response. We sent mathematical formulas, cultural information, maps showing our location, all of it deliberate, all of it intentional, and all of it ignored. Because we were shouting in a language no one spoke. But when we built GPS satellites, when we synchronized atomic clocks across continents, when we created technology that required microsecond precision across global networks, we finally said something comprehensible. Not a greeting, not a message, just structure. And something answered, not with words, not with ships, but with attention. 6 months after the White Horse Station closed, Elliot received an unmarked envelope at his new assignment. Inside was a single piece of paper, a graph showing cosmic background measurements from multiple monitoring stations across the globe. The patterns were unmistakable now, synchronized, structured, intentional. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a single sentence in pen. "This should not continue." Elliot kept the paper. He also kept monitoring, because the truth was already loose, not in dramatic revelations or government press conferences, but in the quiet accumulation of data, in the subtle changes to background noise that careful observers were beginning to notice. Humanity had made contact, not through intention, but through infrastructure. And whatever had made contact in return was not going away. It was embedding itself deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum, learning, adapting, waiting to see what humanity would do next. Elliot sometimes wondered what would happen when the presence decided to move beyond listening, when acknowledgement became interaction, when the patterns in the noise resolved into something unmistakable. But for now, the contact remained quiet. A presence in the static, a structure in the chaos, proof that we were no longer alone, and proof that we had been noticed by something that did not think the way we did not exist the way we did, and did not want the same things we wanted. as something that had been waiting a very long time and was now fully aware of our existence. On a cold night in late March, Elliot initiated one final calibration pulse from a university radio telescope where Marcus worked. They waited. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it did not mirror their signal. It anticipated it. The response arrived 7 seconds after transmission, then 6 seconds, then 5. The presence was learning, understanding, adapting to human timing, human patterns, human structure. It was closing the gap between signal and response, moving from acknowledgement towards something that looked disturbingly like conversation. Marcus and Elliot stared at the data in silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What do we do?" Elliot did not have an answer. Humanity had asked if anyone was out there. The universe had answered, not with a visit, but with attention. And now something vast and patient and utterly alien was learning to speak our language. Not because it wanted to communicate meaning, but because it wanted to understand structure. And once it understood structure, what would it do? Elliot shut down the equipment and walked outside. The sky was clear. Stars scattered across the darkness in familiar patterns. Somewhere among those stars, conventional wisdom said intelligent life might exist, but the truth was closer and stranger, and it had been listening all along. We never asked if anyone was out there. We just built systems loud enough to be noticed, and the universe finally answered, not with a visit, but with attention. The question now was what came next. What happened when attention became intention? When listening became action? When the quiet contact stopped being quiet? Elliot looked up at the stars and felt the weight of all the electromagnetic signals humanity had ever transmitted, spreading outward at the speed of light, announcing our presence to a universe we barely understood. And somewhere in the fabric of that universe, something was listening, learning, waiting. The age of accidental contact had begun, and there was no going back.